China has no historic rights on what some describe as rock outcroppings in the South China Sea. That's the decision of an international tribunal that ruled in favor of the Philippines and its fishermen. Ahead of the announcement, Beijing was already calling the process a farce. So, will China abide or keep on patrolling waters that are 120 kilometers from the Philippines shore? And will Beijing keep on building artificial islands? We're going to be paying particular attention to the reactions of the new Filipino president, the tough-talking Rodrigo Duterte, who on the campaign trail claimed he would jet ski to one of the islands. Will he cut a deal or ratchet up the rhetoric, like Japan and Vietnam have done in similar disputes? The United States, which recently launched joint patrols with the Philippines, will be watching warily the reactions of all parties. It's also a chance to weigh up how China sees itself on the world stage. China, which has gone from strength to strength, which now sends peacekeepers to Africa. Will it want to flout rulings from a body to which it's a signatory? Will it be more or less muscle flexing now that China's economy has cooled? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at those who are pushing perhaps the boundaries in the South China Sea. With us from Manila, Jay Batong Bakal, director of the University of Philippines Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening or good morning, as the case may be.
Yeah, it's very late where you are. Thank you. Thanks again. We appreciate it. Also joining us, his postings for the Reuters news agency include in Malaysia and Japan. Nelson Graves, founder of News Decoder. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
David Camero, senior lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are you, sir?
Fine.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. At The Hague, both sides had their supporters, with pro-China and pro-Philippines activists both pointing to maps and dotted lines drawn in the 1940s in some instances. And as you can see, drawing different conclusions. Diptyque Laurent has the story.
Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte won't be needing his jet skis after all. The leader of the Philippines said during his presidential campaign that if the Hague Court's South China Sea ruling went against the Philippines, he would ride a jet ski into the sea and plant a Filipino flag on one of China's airports there. Although the Hague's ruling for the Philippines is not legally enforceable, it could set a precedent for China's other regional neighbors who are also disputing their share of the waters. The conflict dates back to 1947, when Beijing claimed that the Paracel and Spratly island chains were integral parts of China, the so-called Nine-Dash Line. Vietnam has hotly contested this for decades. Tensions escalated in the 1970s and 80s in both island chains, leading to the deaths of several Vietnamese troops. The Philippines and China also lay claim to the Scarborough Shoal, a triangular-shaped series of reefs and rocks that provide for fertile fishing grounds. In 2012, the two countries were locked in a maritime standoff after accusing each other of intrusions in the area. The Philippines, along with Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam and China, are all disputing the Spratly Islands as well. In particular, China has angered its neighbors in recent months by installing missile launchers, runways and barracks on the islands, as these photos show. It's no surprise that each regional neighbor wants its part of the sea. The South China Sea brings in $5.3 trillion in trade every year, and one-third of the world's shipping passes through here. It reportedly has 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The dispute has intensified China's rivalry with the United States, which is also vying for influence in the region. Washington hopes to take advantage of China's souring relations, especially with the Philippines and Vietnam.
All right, that report there by Diptyque Laurent. Jay Batong Bakal, the complaint was lodged there, I guess you could call it a complaint, before what's called the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2013. If I understand correctly, you advised on this.
Well, I'm not really part of the team, but I do comment on it in public because there really is a lack of people here who have the, I guess, the specialization to make comments on these events.
Now, you take this case a little under 3 years ago to The Hague. China, from the outset, says it doesn't want any part of it and boycotts all of the proceedings. What's your reaction to that?
Well, while China has done that, legally it is still bound by the convention as well as all the dispute settlement provisions. So it may keep on saying this, but that doesn't change the fact, the reality that it did make a commitment to the convention and the dispute settlement provisions. So it really has to take a step back and consider whether it is in its long-term interest to be perceived as flouting the convention or whether it should reconsider.
The argument that we've seen in Chinese state media that this is a U.S.-influenced decision. What's your reaction?
Well, this is a story that has been floated ever since this whole dispute began, this case began. But really, I think it's because China simply doesn't understand the Philippines and the way that the politics works here. The Philippines took this decision entirely on its own. No? And even the United States was probably surprised when it was announced that we would be taking China to court.
All right, David Cameron, when you woke up this morning, there was no suspense over what the decision would be.
I think the Chinese also are expecting it, given that they've been conducting this public relations, public diplomacy campaign for several months, announcing in advance, even before the judgment, that they wouldn't accept the result and the judgment itself. And I think also the fact that the United States was not involved is also linked to the fact that the US hasn't ratified UNCLOS, the convention. And while it claims that it respects the provisions of the convention, it's not actually a member of that treaty, which, as has just been mentioned by a colleague, China is legally bound, having signed the convention.
Legally bound. Nelson Graves, is this a good news or a bad news story? Since China doesn't show up, says it's a farce, is it? But yet it's happening in front of a legal body. Should we expect further escalation?
That's an unanswered question at this point. I think undoubtedly in the confines of this tribunal, it's a very negative development for China. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the court came down in almost every instance in favor of the Philippines. On the other hand, as Professor just said, China has been expecting this, perhaps not of this magnitude, but they've been expecting a negative outcome for some months now. And for their internal public, they've addressed a very strong message to their to their citizens that this is a farce, as you said, and the body has no standing in this issue. So I think we will see whether China takes any aggressive moves in the region. I doubt it. I don't think that they will backtrack in any way. This is indeed a legally binding decision, but it is not enforceable, and I don't think it in any great way changes the reality on the ground.
All right, so you doubt they'll take it, that there will be an escalation. We can now join from Beijing Liao Shiping, who teaches international law at Beijing Normal University. Thank you for joining us at this very late hour where you are. You've heard the reaction there of Nelson Graves saying that people are wary, but they don't expect an escalation after this. First of all, what's your reaction to that decision out of The Hague?
Yes, to be honest, and I feel not quite surprised to the final words about the tribunal. But what makes me a little bit astonished is that the legal reasoning in the was in order to reach such a unanimous words who is against China. Yes.
But when we look at just explain it for us. When we look at the map and we see some of those islands are so close to the Philippines and so far away from China, how can China lay claim to those islands?
Yes, as we all know, the distance between the islands and the land is never the critical element in the cause of the determination of sovereignty. Just as everybody knows, as the Great Britain also climbs the islands quite far away from its mainland, which is quite near to Argentina.
To the Falkland Islands. Jay Batong Bakpal.
Yes, well, I think we need to clarify when it comes to the claims over the islands themselves, the sovereignty over the islands, and the territorial sea around them. The tribunal made it clear that the judgment doesn't apply to those particular areas. What the case is concerned about is really the areas beyond it, which covers all the waters, 12 nautical miles from all of the features, up to the full extent of the 9-dash line. That is really what the tribunal was addressing itself to. It's not a case of a decision on the islands themselves or the features.
All right, and that is, of course, a key element. Gosh, David Cameron, I was reading that we're talking about an area where 1/3 of the world's maritime traffic goes through. We're talking about 12% of the fishing waters of our planet. There's a lot at stake here.
There is a lot at stake, and one of the elements of the decision from The Hague was over China's destruction of the fishing habitat, and that was a little bit unexpected, that they were taken to task by building these artificial islands. They were destroying fishing grounds of Filipino fishers, but also of other fishermen in the area. Yes, it is an area which is rich in maritime and sea life. We're not quite sure about the extent of oil and gas and minerals in the area. There's some debate on that, but there potentially there's a lot at stake here.
All right, for his part, the Chinese foreign minister did not mince words when it came to an arbitration that, again, it boycotted from start to finish.
Now, this farce is over, and it's time to get back on the right track. We've noticed that the new government of the Philippines has made statements indicating a willingness to resume negotiations with China over the South China Sea issue.
Jay Batong Bakal, do you agree this is all just a prelude to a pragmatic sit-down between the Philippines' new president and the leaders of China?
Well, given the fact that the arbitration does not have an enforcement mechanism, I think it's inevitable that the Philippines would have had to come to negotiations anyway. In fact, one of the objectives of the Philippines in filing this case was really to break a kind of deadlock on negotiations that had been in place for more than a decade already. So that's not surprising.
And does the ruling break the deadlock?
Yes, in a big way, it does break the deadlock because one of the primary sources of the deadlock is China's assertion that it had vast rights over the entire area of the South China Sea, practically. And these rights were being set up by China against Philippine rights to its exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. And this decision clearly says that, China is wrong when it asserts such rights over a vast area of the Philippine EEZ continental shelf. Any rights that China can claim should only be limited to the islands or the territorial sea around those islands. But everywhere else, which covers a huge area for the Philippines really, is entirely and exclusively under Philippine jurisdiction. And it's only the Philippines which has rights over them.
Liao Shiping, do you agree that now that the ruling has passed, it's going to make it easier in a way to negotiate?
Yes, to be honest, I don't think the award which published today is a good chance for both China and Philippines to renegotiate on the issues of the South China Sea, because the words has been made in such a ridiculous way, which will, to some extent, make even the most modest Chinese people into the situation of challenging or questioning the legitimacy of the tribunal and its word.
So has China, in a way, talked itself into a corner by ratcheting up the rhetoric?
Yeah, but maybe I think so. But I think we still need to have more time to read or to examine the specific content of the tribunal words in details, and just in order to get more and more information and make full comprehension of the legal reasoning of the words, which means what actually China has lost in the procedure.
All right, on the hashtag F24 debate, lots of reactions from viewers. Dan on Facebook, using the parlance of chess, next move is China's. Nelson Graves, on this point, when you see the reactions that have come out after the ruling, is the groundwork laid for perhaps something positive to come out?
I think there is the potential for this to break a logjam between Beijing and Manila. That's true. I think China is, this is the first time that China has been summoned before the international justice system. And there is a larger issue at stake here, and that is whether China is following international rules, and they are aware of that. And so they've tried to marshal a rather large number of other countries to support their position here, that this is an illegitimate ruling and that the court has no standing.
And China's not a sidelines player when it comes to international institutions.
Not at all. As we know, as we all know, they're a member of the UN Security Council, and their argument is that issues of sovereignty have to be taken before another court, the International Court of Justice, also in The Hague. So there are questions of jurisdiction and legal questions at issue here, but I do think from a practical standpoint, this doesn't radically change matters on the ground. China, I think, will be they will do everything they can in the area to reassert their control. I doubt that they will do any provocative moves. The U.S. is very present there with both its Navy and its Air Force. So I see a period of some uncertainty, but I do think that there are enough common interests between China, the United States, so that there won't be any flare-up.
We're going to pick up on what those common interests are when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate.